Opening the flank with the English, white immediately seeks imbalanced pawn structures and control of key central squares. Opening the diagonal for the queen and bishop, but it slightly hinders the c8 bishop's development. Developing a piece towards the center, this knight prepares to support a pawn push and control key squares. Embracing the center, black immediately challenges white's queenside pawns, creating immediate central tension and opening up possibilities for bishop activity. Establishing central pawn presence now challenges black's d-pawn, opening pathways for piece development. Developing knights swiftly contests central squares and prepares for kingside castling. Establishing central pawn presence and developing a knight for piece activity creates a solid foundation for kingside expansion. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies black's king position and prepares for castling, a prudent step in this open English. Developing the bishop to this square creates immediate dynamic possibilities and potentially hinders black's queenside expansion. Fortifying the monarch secures the immediate flank, prioritizing safety before delving into central maneuvering. Solidifying the pawn center and preparing a kingside development, this move creates a robust pawn triangle while subtly inviting further pawn thrusts from black. Unleashing central pressure, black immediately challenges white's ambitious pawn structure and prepares to liberate their own queenside. This audacious counterstrike forces white to confront immediate questions about their central space and the harmony of their pieces. Opening the center with this capture creates a dynamic tension, immediately challenging black's pawn structure and potentially freeing up lines for white's pieces while sacrificing a tempo for piece activity. Recapturing the pawn with the bishop strategically reclaims central influence and opens a diagonal for future play, effectively challenging white's intention to create a cramped position. Positioning the queen centrally to support the d4 pawn and prepare for potential queenside expansion, while also guarding the c5 bishop from a d6 push, creates a flexible pawn structure and enhances piece coordination. Developing the knight to its most active square immediately pins down the center and challenges white's pawn structure, preparing for a dynamic pawn break with e5 or c4 later. Asserting control over the open d-file is the primary objective here, potentially preparing for a pawn push to e4 or a subsequent rook lift to the queenside. Activating the queen to support the central pawn structure, while preparing for potential counterplay on the queenside, this queen maneuver also aims to contest white's control of the d-file, hinting at future activity and aiming to consolidate black's position before committing to further pawn breaks. Securing the queenside with a pawn advance, white seeks to solidify their structure and potentially create space for future piece maneuvering, aiming to constrain black's queenside development. Sacrificing the pawn opens up a diagonal for your queen and aims to disrupt white's central control, forcing a reshuffle of their pieces and potentially creating weaknesses. Snatching the pawn opens a dynamic exchange, but at what cost to piece activity and central influence? The pawn capture is now returned, but at a cost. Black exchanges a potentially active bishop for a knight, simplifying the center and clearing a diagonal for their queen, though white's knight now occupies a strong central outpost. The pawn sacrifice on d4 injects immediate tactical chaos, opening the e-file for white's rook and creating a dynamic imbalance where black's central pawn structure is fractured. A strategic reallocation of forces, the rook heads to the open file, asserting its presence and preparing for potential exchanges or an aggressive central thrust. Unleashing the bishop to d4 opens a diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's already compressed pawn structure while developing an attacking piece. Unleashing the knight to g4 injects immediate chaos into white's queenside, probing the relatively undefended bishop and threatening to dismantle the pawn structure with a decisive fork on e3 if white isn't vigilant. Reclaiming central space and preparing for a more stable pawn structure is the immediate aim here, as white reshapes their pieces to weather the storm of black's active knight and potential pressure on the kingside. Unleashing a pawn thrust with immediate consequences, this move decisively alters the central landscape, aiming to shatter white's pawn formation and open lines for black's pieces. Pushing the pawn to d5 aims to solidify the center and potentially trap black's knight, while also carving out more space for white's pieces. Seeking immediate tactical complications, the knight repositions to a central outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially fork key pieces. Sacrificing the bishop opens a critical diagonal for the queen, simultaneously severing the connection between black's knight and its pawns, potentially creating a backward d-pawn on black's side and a clear path for white's rook on the d-file. The d4 pawn now anchors black's center, creating a deep outpost for the knight and potentially opening lines for the rook on the d-file. The queen boldly steps into the fray, aiming to exploit black's compromised pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances against the king. Unleashing the queen towards the king's flank creates immediate tactical chaos, aiming to exploit the potentially exposed white monarch, but it requires precise calculation to avoid overextension. The queen's return to the center immediately intensifies the pressure on black's disorganized pieces, eyeing potential weaknesses while solidifying white's control over crucial squares and preparing to contest the open files for a potential endgame advantage. The rook's re-entry onto the e-file immediately challenges white's bishop on e3 and aims to create a battery with the queen, potentially targeting the vulnerable white king. Reclaiming the open d-file and consolidating pressure towards black's vulnerable castled position is the immediate objective here, establishing a robust battery on the d-file and preparing to exert greater influence over the center. The queen boldly ventures towards white's queenside, seeking any weakness or tactical entanglement, but it leaves her exposed and potentially adrift as white consolidates on the kingside. Challenging the pesky knight's occupation of g4, this timely pawn advance initiates a subtle restructuring of white's pawn chain, aiming to dislodge the black knight and potentially open lines for its own pieces, while also creating a defensive pawn shield for the king that might prove useful later on. A sharp tactical skirmish is brewing on the queenside, and this maneuver aims to disrupt white's tightly controlled central pawn structure by creating an immediate threat to the bishop. Repositioning the rook to the second rank aims to contest the open d-file and potentially support a future advance on that central pathway, while also offering flexibility for further coordination with the other rook. Instantly, the rook on d8 claims an open file, a bold assertion of presence on a contested central line, aiming to disrupt white's rook coordination and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses on the d-file. The monarch finally retreats to a safer haven, a wise maneuver to escape the looming threats and consolidate forces behind the pawns, a necessary precaution given the open lines and black's aggressive piece placement. A bold repositioning, aiming to disrupt white's established central control and seize an outpost on a crucial square. This maneuver injects dynamism into the position, challenging the rook's reign on the d-file and hinting at a potential kingside invasion if white falters in their defensive setup. Consider the long-term implications for piece harmony. That knight's relocation could unlock attacking avenues or become a solitary, vulnerable pawn if unsupported. Challenging the knight's aggressive placement, white aims to disrupt the pawn structure and create opportunities on the open d-file. This bold pawn thrust seeks to dislodge the knight and potentially open lines toward black's weakened king. By committing the f-pawn, white sacrifices some defensive integrity for an active counterplay, hoping to exploit the newly created space and potentially launch an attack. It's a significant shift in the game's dynamic, from a relatively balanced position to one with immediate, tangible threats. The knight's journey to g6 aims to disrupt white's king's safety, potentially forking the queen and rook if white isn't careful with the upcoming king's side maneuvers. Consolidating the queen's pressure while simultaneously preparing a regrouping for the minor pieces marks the essence of this maneuver. The repositioning of the queen from the active but somewhat exposed d3 square to f2 aims to establish a more robust defensive and offensive posture. From f2, the queen can better support potential pawn advances, particularly the f-pawn, and keep an eye on the kingside. Simultaneously, this move frees up the d3 rook, which might be intending to join the attack on the kingside or reinforce the central control. It's a subtle shift, often overlooked, that can significantly alter the dynamic of the board, allowing for future development of pieces that were previously hemmed in by the queen's position. This is about creating options and subtly tightening the defensive grip. Launching a counteroffensive on the queenside with b6 aims to open lines for the queenside pawns and potentially gain space, but it weakens the pawn structure around the monarch. The pawns advance on b4 aims to reclaim central influence and restrict black's knight's potential outpost, while simultaneously bolstering white's queenside structure and preparing for a potential queenside expansion. Reclaiming the bishop's outpost on e4 untangles black's pieces, preparing to eye the white king and potentially challenge the open files for control. Reinforcing the central dark squares, this bishop move aims to solidify white's control over the e4-d5 diagonal and prevent black's knights from finding comfortable outposts. It also offers a potential retreat square for the queen should it come under further pressure, subtly improving coordination within white's pieces while keeping lines of retreat open. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm now, f5 aims to gain space and restrict white's minor pieces, particularly the bishop on e2, potentially preparing for an aggressive advance with f4-f3 later. This bold pawn thrust, however, leaves the king somewhat exposed and creates potential weaknesses on dark squares around the monarch. It's a double-edged decision that demands careful follow-up to justify the positional concessions. Undermining black's queenly support structure, this bishop sacrifice seizes the initiative. Unlocking the e-file, this pawn push aggressively reclaims central space after the exchange, creating immediate pressure and opening a direct assault line toward white's king. Unlocking the open files for the rooks seems to be the primary objective here, aiming to activate those heavy pieces along the now cleared central files and potentially pressure black's somewhat exposed monarch.